I can't. Every time I look at you, I see the bodies they say you've buried. The heavy crystal glass didn't shatter. It simply thudded onto the plush velvet carpet, the amber liquid staining the floor like an old wound. Choi Tae-Rin stood frozen in the center of his penthouse, watching yet another woman scramble for the door, her eyes wide with a terror that no amount of diamonds could mask. "I'm sorry, Tae-Rin. You're a king, but you're a king of ghosts." The door clicked shut with a finality that felt like a guillotine. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Tae-Rin didn't pour a drink. His hands were too steady, his heart too cold. That was the third arrangement this month that had ended in a flight of fear. To the city he was the Dragon of Seoul, an unreadable force of nature. To himself he was a specimen under glass, feared, respected, and utterly untouched. His phone buzzed on the obsidian desk. Back Sung Chol. "Boss, Lee Sok-tae is moving on the Incheon docks. We need the dragon." Tae-Rin stared at the screen. For once, the dragon was tired of breathing fire. He ignored the call, his mind spiraling back to the sovereign flaw he had tried so hard to hide. He was a man who had built an empire, but couldn't keep a woman in a room for more than an hour. 2 nights later, the political theater of the Kim Foundation Gala demanded his presence. Tae-Rin walked into the ballroom wearing a black suit that felt like armor, his tattoos hidden beneath silk cuffs, his face a mask of unreadable calm. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Wall Street sharks and old money heirs lowered their voices as he passed. He was a predator in a room full of prey. He ordered a double whiskey and leaned against the marble pillar, feeling the absolute isolation settle into his bones. He had everything a man could want, and he was the most alone person in the building. Then the profound silence of his internal world was broken. He saw her at the far end of the terrace, Elise Turner. She wasn't dancing or networking, she was standing by the railing, her posture grounded and alert, looking out at the Han River with a steady resolve that made the frantic energy of the gala seem like children's play. She didn't move like the others, she didn't flutter or perform. When she turned, her eyes scanned the crowd, landing on Tae-Rin. She didn't look away, she didn't bow, she didn't flee. She watched him with a surgical calm that mirrored his own, her gaze weighing his worth not as a mafia king, but as a man. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. She had the look of a survivor, someone who understood that the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't the man with the tattoos, but the man who had forgotten how to feel. Tae-Rin found himself moving towards her before his mafia mask could intervene. His enforcers, Kwon Dae-shik and Oh Min-jae, fell into step behind him, but he waved them off. He reached the terrace, the cool night air a relief. Elise didn't flinch as he stopped in her personal space. She was half leaning against the stone, braced and present. "You're the one they tell the stories about, the one people run from." Tae-Rin didn't offer a polite smile. He arched an eyebrow, a sovereign challenge in his eyes. "And yet you're still standing here." Elise arched an eyebrow back, her eyes missing nothing. "I've seen monsters before, Mr. Choi. You look more like a man who's just tired of the noise. I'll give you 5 minutes of my time. After that, we'll see if I have a reason to run." The headquarters of the Choi syndicate stood as a monolith of glass and steel against the gray Seoul skyline, a structure that breathed with the surgical coldness of its master. Inside the top-floor command center, the air was pressurized and sterile, devoid of the frantic heat of the city below. Choi Tae-Rin sat behind an expansive desk of polished obsidian, his unreadable calm anchored by the slow rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to dictate the pace of the underworld. To his left stood Baek Sung-chul, a man of stone-faced loyalty whose eyes never seemed to blink. Sung-chul was the hammer of the organization. He didn't require explanations or justifications, only a direction. To Tae-Rin's right was Kwon Dae-shik, the ex-military watcher who mapped the logic of shadows with a clinical detachment that made him more machine than man. Together, they formed the surgical shield around their king, a barrier that ensured the world only saw the dragon's fire and never his face. "The Incheon shipments are delayed, boss," Dae-shik said, his voice a low, metallic vibration that carried no emotion. "Lee Sok-tae's people are interfering with the logistics. It's a deliberate provocation." Tae-Rin didn't look up from the leather-bound ledger. He adjusted his cufflink with a restrained power that made the air in the room feel suddenly thinner. "Let them provoke," he murmured, his voice a chilling, steady vibration. "Lee Sok-tae is a man who confuses noise with authority. We do not answer noise, we answer result." Sung-chul shifted his weight, his presence a silent promise of violence. "Shall I send the blackout protocol to the docks?" "Not yet," Tae-Rin replied, finally closing the book. He stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking over the empire he had built from blood and profound silence. "We are in a period of transition. The city expects me to be a monster, Sung-chul, but a monster is predictable. A king is not." His mind drifted for a split second to the gala, to the woman who hadn't bowed, the one who had looked into his unreadable calm and seen the man beneath. Elise Turner was a variable he hadn't planned for, a sovereign equal who had introduced a throb and thrust of real emotion into his sterile world. He turned back to his enforcers, his face once again a mask of surgical coldness. "Monitor the docks but do not engage. I want Sok-tae to think he's won. I want him to grow loud, because in this city, the only thing more dangerous than a dragon's fire is a dragon's patience." The modern king sat back down, the absolute isolation of his throne reclaimed. He was a man feared by the city, but as he stared at the obsidian desk, he realized he was finally waiting for something other than a betrayal. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and shadow, perched so high above the city that the neon lights of Seoul looked like distant dying embers. Choi Tae-Rin stood by the window, his tailored black suit blending into the darkness, his unreadable calm acting as a shield against the quiet intimacy of the room. Behind him, Elise sat in the armchair, her posture grounded and alert. She didn't look like a woman waiting for a king. She looked like a woman waiting for a man to stop lying to himself. "You've been standing there for 10 minutes, Tae-Rin," Elise said, her voice a steady melodic vibration that cut through the surgical silence. "In this light, you look exactly like the statues they put in corporate lobbies, perfect, cold, and entirely hollow. Is that the plan, to wait until I get bored and run away like the others?" Tae-Rin turned slowly, his restrained power vibrating in the space between them. He walked towards her, his footsteps silent on the silk rug. He stopped just outside her personal space, his head tilting towards her with a focused, predatory patience. "The stories they tell about me aren't fiction, Elise. People run because survival is a natural instinct. Fear is the only honest emotion most people have in my presence." Elise didn't flinch. She leaned forward, the soft light catching her resolve in her eyes. "Fear is easy. It's a script. You wear that mafia mask because it's easier to be a monster than to be someone who can be hurt. But I'm not looking at the Dragon of Seoul right now. I'm looking at a man who is just tired of being feared that he's forgotten how to be touched." The chaos versus composure dynamic in the room shifted violently. Tae-Rin's jaw tightened, a flash of raw malice flickering in his eyes before being instantly suppressed by his surgical coldness. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face, not a threat, but a sovereign challenge. "You think you can see beneath the suit?" he whispered, his voice a chilling, steady vibration. "There is nothing there but the weight of the city and the scars of the men who tried to take it."
"Then show me the scars," Elise countered, her hand rising to meet his, her fingers steady as they brushed against his silk cuff. "Stop performing, Tae-Rin. The city isn't watching right now. I am, and I'm still here."
For the first time in a decade, the modern king felt the mask slip. The absolute isolation he had cultivated like a weapon began to crumble under her steady resolve. He didn't pull away. He stood there, caught in the gravity of a woman who didn't want his power or his money, but his truth. The profound silence was no longer a weapon, it was a bridge. Tae-Rin realized that Elise Turner wasn't just a woman who didn't run, she was the only one who knew that the dragon's fire was actually a plea for the light. The low-lit interior of a private membership lounge in Gangnam smelled of expensive tobacco and raw malice. Lee Sok-tae sat draped across a leather armchair, swirling a glass of aged cognac with a restless, jagged energy. Unlike Tae-Rin's unreadable calm, Sok-tae was a storm of reckless ambition, his every movement a rhythmic noise of suppressed violence. Across from him, Park Myung-soo watched with a polished danger, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "The dragon is distracted," Sok-tae hissed, the glass clicking sharply against his ring. "He's skipping doc manifest meetings to stand on terraces with an American woman. He's forgotten that in this city, if you stop breathing fire, people start wondering if you're out of fuel." Myung-soo leaned forward, his voice a smooth, oily vibration. "He isn't just distracted, Sok-tae. He's compromised. I've watched them. He looks at her with a sovereign vulnerability I haven't seen in him since the old wars. He's built a fortress around himself for 10 years, but he's left the front gate wide open for her." Sok-tae's eyes narrowed, a surgical precision entering his gaze as he processed the information. He pulled up a surveillance photo on his phone, a grainy shot of Tae-Rin and Elise on the penthouse balcony. The logic of the abyss was clear to him now. Tae-Rin wasn't a monster because he was heartless, he was a monster because he had nothing to lose. Elise Turner changed that equation. "She's his sovereign flaw," Sok-tae murmured, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Tae-Rin thinks he's found a partner who won't run. He doesn't realize that her staying is exactly what's going to destroy him. If the city stops fearing the dragon, it's because they've found the person who makes the dragon bleed." "What's the move?" Myung-soo asked, his posture shifting into restrained power. "We don't hit him," Sok-tae replied, standing up and smoothing his suit jacket with a chilling, steady touch. "We hit the anchor. If we take Elise, we don't just take his woman, we take his mask. I want to see the modern king on his knees, begging for the one thing he can't buy with his blood money." The shadow of the air began to spread across the city's underbelly. As the logic of shadows tightened around the penthouse, Elise remained unaware that her choice to stay had just made her the most valuable pawn in a war for the throne. The surgical coldness of the city was about to meet the heat of Sok-tae's ambition, and the modern king was about to learn the true cost of being touched. The afternoon light in the syndicate's private garden was a pale, filtered gold caught between the high stone walls and the sprawling maple trees. Elise sat on a low wooden bench, the surgical silence of the estate pressing in around her. She wasn't alone. Han Soo-yeon, a woman who moved with the ghostly grace of a long-term survivor, emerged from the shadows of the walkway. She carried a tray of tea, but her eyes held the profound, watchful silence of someone who had seen the dragon's fire from the inside. "You're thinking about the man beneath the suit," Han Soo-yeon said, her voice a dry rasp that didn't quite reach a whisper. She sat beside Elise, her posture a masterpiece of restrained tension.
You think because he didn't let you run he's found your match, but you aren't the first woman to stand in his light, Elise. You're just the first one who hasn't seen the shadow it casts." Elise met her gaze, her steady resolve unwavering despite the coldness in Han Soo-yeon's tone. Tae-Rin isn't the monster the city says he is. He's a man who has been isolated by his own power. "Power in this world isn't a crown, it's a parasite," Han Soo-yeon countered, her hand trembling slightly as she poured the tea. She pulled back her silk sleeve just enough to reveal a jagged scar, a surgical record of a past war. "I loved a man like him once, a king of a different throne. I thought my love was a shield. I thought if I stayed I could anchor him to the world. But when the rivals come, and they always come, they don't aim for the king. They aim for the person who makes the king human." The logic of the abyss was clear in Han Soo-yeon's warning. She wasn't speaking out of jealousy, but out of a surgical precision for the truth. In the syndicate, an emotional connection wasn't a sanctuary, it was a sovereign flaw. "Lee Sok-tae is already watching you," Han Soo-yeon continued, her eyes missing nothing. "He sees the way Tae-Rin looks at you. He sees the mafia mask slipping. To the city, you are the woman who didn't run. To Tae-Rin's enemies, you are simply the target that doesn't move. If you stay, you aren't just loving a man, you are volunteering to be the collateral damage when his empire eventually burns." Elise looked at the tea, the chaos versus composure dynamic warring within her. She realized then that her choice to stay wasn't just a romantic act, it was a tactical decision. To love the dragon was to accept that she was now the most dangerous variable in a war she hadn't started. "Thank you for the tea, Soo-yeon," Elise said softly, her voice regaining its melodic vibration. "But I've already weighed the risk. I'm not here because I'm soft. I'm here because I'm the only one who can stand in the fire with him." Soo-yeon stood, her face returning to its unreadable calm. "Then I hope your skin is thicker than mine was, because when the dragon starts to bleed, the whole city catches fire." The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a cathedral of polished danger, dripping in crystal chandeliers and the heavy scent of lilies. Choi Tae-Rin moved through the crowd with his signature unreadable calm, a black-clad titan among the city's elite. At his side, Elise Turner was a vision of steady resolve, her neutral-toned gown a quiet defiance against the gaudy displays of wealth. Park Myung-soo, the smiling traitor, stood near the champagne fountain, his posture a masterclass in restrained power. He raised a glass to Tae-Rin, his expression warm, but the logic of the watcher in Elise's mind flagged the subtle tension in his jaw, the contempt leak that signaled the secret superiority. "The merger is finalized, Tae-Rin," Myung-soo said, his voice a smooth, oily vibration. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate a business deal, we celebrate the absolute security of the Choi syndicate." But as the clock struck midnight, the blackout protocol was triggered. The chandeliers flickered and died, plunging the cathedral into a profound, watchful silence. In the sudden darkness, the rhythmic noise of silenced weapons echoed from the balconies. Tae-Rin reacted with surgical precision, pulling Elise behind a marble pillar just as a spray of bullets shattered the champagne fountain. Through the green glow of emergency lights, Elise saw Myung-soo. He wasn't ducking for cover, he was standing perfectly still, his mafia mask gone, replaced by the raw malice of an heir who had finally claimed his throne. "The dragon is blind," Myung-soo boomed through the chaos, no longer polished but jagged and triumphant. "Sok-tae was right. You traded your fire for a woman, Tae-Rin, and now you'll burn in the dark." The Judas kiss was complete.
Myung-soo had leveraged the gala's security, the very system Tae-Rin had trusted him to build, to create a golden cage for his king. From the shadows, the reckless ambition of Lee Sok-tae emerged, his silhouette framed by the muzzle flashes of his mercenaries. "I'm not blind, Myung-soo," Tae-Rin whispered into the dark, his voice a chilling, steady vibration that made even the mercenaries hesitate. He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, but for a small detonator Elise had helped him calibrate. "I just wanted to see who would be the first to reach for the knife." With a surgical trigger, the secondary power grid roared to life, blinding the attackers with high-intensity floodlights. The chaos versus composure dynamic flipped in a heartbeat. The dragon hadn't been caught. He had simply invited the traitors to his own execution ground. The neon pulse of the city felt like a rhythmic assault as Tae-Rin and Elise moved through the narrow, steam-filled alleys of Mapo-gu. The surgical coldness of the gala had been replaced by the raw malice of the hunt. Tae-Rin leaned heavily against Elise, his hand pressed against a dark bloom of red spreading across his white dress shirt. The modern king was bleeding, his unreadable calm fractured by the physical toll of the betrayal. "Stay in the shadows," Tae-Rin rasped, his voice a low, vibrating thread of its former strength. "The main roads are monitored by Myung-soo's logic of shadows. We have to use the old utility tunnels near the river." Elise didn't hesitate. Her steady resolve had transformed into a surgical calm of her own. She anchored his weight, her neutral-toned gown now stained with his blood and the grime of the city's underbelly. She wasn't a victim of the chaos. She was the architect of survival, navigating the labyrinthine streets with a focus that made Tae-Rin's enforcers seem like amateurs. They reached a nondescript steel door behind a row of humming industrial refrigerators. Elise used the blackout protocol codes Tae-Rin had whispered to her, the heavy lock clicking open with a profound, watchful silence. Inside, the safe house was a fortress of minimalism, cold, sterile, and stocked with the surgical precision required for a man who lived on the edge of the abyss. As the door hissed shut, Tae-Rin collapsed onto a medical cot, his breath hitching as the adrenaline began to fade. He looked up at Elise, his eyes, usually so unreadable, now reflecting a sovereign vulnerability. "You could have left," Tae-Rin murmured, the mafia mask slipping entirely. "When the lights went out, you had the perfect window to run. Why stay?" Elise didn't answer immediately. She began cutting away his shirt to reveal the wound, her fingers steady and authentic. "Because the city only knows the dragon, Tae-Rin," she said softly, her voice a melodic vibration in the cramped space. "But I know the man who was waiting for me in the dark. I didn't stay because I'm a loyal subject. I stayed because I'm the only one who knows that without me, you're just a ghost in a suit." Tae-Rin reached out, his hand trembling as he touched her cheek, the absolute isolation of his life finally shattered. In the surgical silence of the safe house, the modern king realized that his survival didn't depend on his empire or his fire. It depended on the woman who had become his sovereign equal, the one who was currently stitching his world back together. The walls of the safe house felt thinner tonight, the surgical silence of the room replaced by the distant rhythmic hum of the city's machinery. Choi Tae-Rin sat on the edge of the medical cot, his torso wrapped in white gauze that contrasted sharply with his ink-black tattoos. He stared at the security feed on his tablet, watching the logic of shadows play out in real time. Lee Sok-tae had moved his forces to the Incheon port, and the smiling traitor Park Myung-soo was currently methodically liquidating Tae-Rin's assets. Tae-Rin looked at Elise, who was quietly organizing medical supplies in the corner. Her steady resolve was the only thing keeping the chaos versus composure dynamic from collapsing into total ruin.
He realized then that the city's architecture of power was a zero-sum game. He could not protect the throne and the woman simultaneously. The empire required his absolute isolation, while Elise required his presence. "They're not just taking the docks, Elise," Tae-Rin said, his voice a melodic vibration that carried the weight of a final decision. "Sok Tae thinks that by erasing the dragon, he becomes the king. He doesn't realize that the throne is a golden cage I've been trying to unlock for a decade." The sovereign sacrifice was no longer a question of if, but how. Tae-Rin reached into his jacket and pulled out an encrypted drive, the Judas Protocol in its purest form. It contained the financial records and illegal manifests of every major syndicate in Seoul, including his own. To use it was to burn the throne to the ground, ensuring that no one, not even himself, could ever rule this city through fear again. "If I do this," Tae-Rin whispered, meeting Elise's eyes with a sovereign vulnerability, "I won't be a king anymore. I'll be a target for every agency from here to Interpol. The dragon dies tonight, Elise. Are you sure you want to be there for the aftermath?" Elise walked over and knelt beside him, her hand covering the drive, her fingers steady and authentic. "Because I didn't choose a king, Tae-Rin. I chose the man who stood in the doorway and waited. Let it burn. We don't need a city that fears you to build a life that knows you." Tae-Rin nodded, his unreadable calm replaced by a chilling, steady focus. He initiated the blackout protocol, the data beginning its irreversible upload to the central servers of the National Police Agency. As the digital fire began to spread through the syndicate's infrastructure, the modern king felt the weight of the city finally lift. He was no longer a monster under glass. He was a man with a match, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the dark. The rain over the Mapo Bridge was a relentless surgical assault, turning the asphalt into a black mirror that reflected the chaotic strobes of police sirens and distant fires. Choi Tae-Rin stood at the center of the span, his silhouette sharp and unwavering against the gale. His white bandage was now a dark, soaked crimson, but his unreadable calm had returned, tempered by the finality of the Judas Protocol.
Lee Sok-tae stood 20 yards away, flanked by the smiling traitor Myung-soo and a phalanx of mercenaries. Sok-tae's reckless ambition had curdled into a frantic, raw malice. He held a detonator in one hand and a weapon in the other, his eyes darting toward the van where Elise was being held by his men. "You burned it all," Sok-tae screamed, his voice a jagged noise lost in the wind. "The accounts, the manifests, the leverage, everything that made us kings. You didn't just kill the syndicate, Tae-Rin, you killed yourself." "I didn't kill the syndicate, Sok-tae," Tae-Rin replied, his voice a chilling, steady vibration that seemed to anchor the very bridge. "I simply stopped pretending that a golden cage was a throne. You wanted to be the dragon. Now you can rule the ashes." The chaos versus composure dynamic reached its breaking point. Sok-tae raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the surgical trigger, but before he could fire, a rhythmic tactical strike from the shadows, Kwon Dae-shik and Baek-sung Chol, moving with stone-faced loyalty, neutralized the mercenaries holding the van. Elise kicked the door open, her steady resolve shining through the grime of the night. She didn't run away, she ran toward the center of the bridge, toward the man who had traded an empire for her breath. "It's over, Sok-tae," Tae-Rin said, walking forward with a sovereign grace that ignored the weapon pointed at his heart. "The city doesn't fear the dragon anymore, and without fear, you have nothing." In a final act of reckless ambition, Sok-tae lunged, but the logic of the abyss was against him. A single surgical precision shot from the shadows ended the coup. As Tae fell, the detonator clattered onto the wet asphalt, harmless. Tae-Rin reached Elise, his hands, once used only for the surgical coldness of power, now trembling as they pulled her into his chest. In the profound silence that followed the gunfire, they stood together on the bridge. The modern king was gone, and the dragon was dead. There was only a man and a woman, standing in the rain, choosing to walk toward a world where they were finally, dangerously, free. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass of a secluded villa overlooking the rugged coastline of Jeju Island, miles away from the neon-choked pressure of Seoul. The air here didn't taste of industrial grease or surgical coldness. It tasted of salt, pine, and a quiet, unburdened freedom. Choi Tae-Rin stood on the terrace, dressed in a simple white linen shirt that billowed slightly in the breeze, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragon's ink that now felt like a historical record rather than a current warning. He wasn't standing in profound silence anymore. He was listening to the rhythmic crashing of the waves and the soft, authentic sound of Elise humming from the kitchen. The modern king had been dead for exactly a year, buried under the digital ashes of the Judas Protocol. The city still whispered about the dragon who burned his own throne, but here he was simply a man who had finally learned to breathe. Elise stepped onto the terrace, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She wore a light sundress, her hair natural and free, her steady resolve now softened into a quiet awareness of their shared peace. She sat in the lounge chair, and Tae-Rin joined her, his posture grounded and alert, but no longer predatory. He didn't reach for a weapon or a phone, he reached for her hand. "The reports came in this morning," Elise said softly, her voice a melodic vibration of calm. "The last of Tae's shell companies were dismantled by the authorities. The logic of shadows has finally been cleared out of the port. The city is moving on, Tae-Rin." Tae-Rin looked at the horizon, his profound, watchful warmth replaced by an intense, loving gaze. "Let it move," he said. "I spent a lifetime building a golden cage because I thought it was the only way to survive. I didn't realize that the only true power is the ability to walk away from the throne and not look back." He squeezed her hand, his fingers tracing the silver line of his own scars, scars that no longer felt like failures, but like the price of his humanity. The absolute isolation that once was his armor was now a distant memory. He had traded a city that feared him for a woman who knew him, and in the surgical precision of that exchange, he had finally won. "You're not thinking about the noise, are you?" Elise asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "No," Tae-Rin whispered, the shadow of a genuine smile touching his face. "I was thinking that this wasn't part of the plan. The plan was to be a king until someone eventually found a bigger knife. The choice was to be a man." As the sun rose higher over the water, casting a long golden glow over the sovereign equals, the silence between them was no longer a cage. It was a sanctuary. The dragon was at rest. The Watcher was home, and the empire they had built together was one of blood and ink no longer. It was one of breath, light, and the simple, terrifying beauty of being seen. This is where tonight's story ends, but the secrets never do. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden power, the silent strength, and the moments that changed everything, make sure you subscribe, like, and share. New stories drop here where power hides in plain sight and the unexpected always rises. Like, share, and tell us what story you want uncovered next. Until next time, stay curious and watch closely.